You are listening to Moments Podcast with me, Shuang Cai. In this show, I am going to talk to artists, academics, industry practitioners, and entrepreneurs from a variety of backgrounds, each of whom is committed to imagining a better tomorrow and working to make it a reality. Some of their experiences are experimental, some are highly practical and ambitious. Most importantly, each dialogue is imaginative, because we want to engage in dialogue with people from all over the world who are curious about life, to enjoy a moment together, to seize the moment, to seize eternity. Join me and these amazing people and their experienced life as it's meant to be lived. Hello everyone, welcome to Moments Podcast. Today we've got Steve Fuller as our guest speaker. Steve is a Professor of Social Science at the University of Warwick in the UK and has made outstanding and exceptional contributions in his field. In March 2025, we had a very pleasant collaboration at a forum organized by the Chinese Students and Scholars Association here at Warwick. And I'm delighted to invite Steve back to my podcast channel today. And now it's your turn to introduce yourself to our listeners, Steve.
Okay, well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me back, Shuang. And in terms of who I am, where I'm coming from, so I've been a professor at Warwick University for 26 years, and I'm originally from the United States. My background's in history, philosophy, and sociology of science, and in recent, I've written about close to 30 books, and I'm known mainly for this field I found called social epistemology, which is about the foundations, the social foundations of knowledge. And in recent years, I've been very interested in written about the future of the university and also the future of humanity, especially given that there are these trans and post-human directions in which human beings can go in the future. And generally, I'm interested in things that are future-oriented.
And I remember that recently you've been to China, right?
That's correct.
China. How was your experience?
Well, it was interesting. And one of the things that I would say is that the context in which I have been in China have had to do with efforts on the part of not only the Chinese state, but also the Chinese Academy to encourage international, sometimes what Chinese call intercivilizational dialogue, and especially with regards to issues having to do with philosophy, and not just philosophy in the narrow academic sense, but also philosophy in terms of a kind of way of life that human beings can pursue together as beings who inhabit the same planet. And so there was this one conference that was very much focused on the Confucian heritage, and the other was a conference organized in Hong Kong, where in the future it looks like there will be a kind of international forum to discuss issues like artificial intelligence and climate change and all these very current sorts of issues that people have been talking about. So I've been there twice for those reasons. In previous years, I've been to China as well, other parts of China. I have keynoted some conferences related to the future of information science and the information society. And there's a great interest in the sort of work I do. I think about 5 or 6 of my books have been translated into Chinese now.
education,
Right,
right?
right.
So both of us, well, I, as a part-time lecturer back in China, and you've been doing higher education for years, and I'm really interested in that. So in China, nowadays, more and more people, maybe because of the decline of the economy or other reasons, but more and more people, students, parents, teachers, they believe that universities should give students more practical skills rather than liberal arts education stuff. So, to what kind of perspective do you see this kind of value or, trend?
Okay, so what I would say is I think it's always been generally a mistake to think about university education as primarily about practical skills. I think that's always been kind of a mistake because really university education is very much founded on a kind of liberal arts foundation in the sense that it's about training the person, right? It's about, in a way, one reason why we call the liberal arts the humanities is because these are the disciplines that you need to have in order to become a fully human being. Okay, and even when we talk about the sciences, of course, the primary forms of university science teaching and research are at the more theoretical level, whether we're talking about physics, chemistry, or biology. Of course, there are engineering schools and medical schools and things like that, but those things actually have existences that predate many universities and were brought into the university system, at least in the West, in the 20th century. And also, one might add law school as well, is a similar kind of situation where they used to exist independently and then got brought into the university. So universities aren't the natural place for teaching practical skills. In fact, one of the reasons why there are things called vocational schools, right, and polytechnics, right, is that those places are actually, because they teach more technical skills that are very directly job related. So if you get, let's say you get a degree in physics, right? A degree in physics does not by itself equip you to be an engineer, right? A degree in physics will teach you about what relativity theory is and quantum mechanics and Newtonian mechanics and all these other topics, right, which are incredibly important and help us understand the way our world works. But it doesn't necessarily give you the kinds of skills that would be needed to actually do something practical in the world, okay? And very often, because there are very few jobs for physicists these days, very often where these physicists go is not into engineering, but they go into computer science. And that is because the mathematical skills that you develop as a physicist are especially valuable for programming. Okay, so in other words, what happens is with a field like physics is that the people get jobs not in the more practical field, but in a field that is about as theoretical as it is, right? But one that has application with computers, right? Which is quite different from the normal kind of engineering. So the point I would make here, though, is that in the last, I would say, 30, 40 years, there has been this idea called the knowledge economy, where universities are supposed to be very important. And the idea being that if more and more people go to universities, and especially if they major in certain kinds of subjects that are seen to be very closely related to sort of the cutting edge fields for employment, right, and the economy, right, that then they will get those jobs and they'll become more productive and the society will become more productive. And so this is the knowledge economy thesis. It was very much, it is certainly, I have to say, in the West, one that has been very strongly endorsed by universities. So it's not something that's had to be forced on universities. Universities have welcomed it because usually the governments will provide more money for the universities in order to take on board more students who will then supposedly get these wonderful productive skills that will then enable them to be productive workers. Okay? And China's followed a similar course to a large extent. Though much more state-directed, but still kind of the same idea. My view about this development, which is, like I say, about 30, 40 years old, is it's failed. And in the sense that the job market is too fluid. And it is not at all clear what specific skills are actually needed given the various changes in the job market. And I know the Chinese government is trying to predict this. And so the Chinese government these days is actually targeting certain areas that they believe are going to be very important in the future, the priorities get changed every couple of years, okay, as the market changes. And so for a certain period of time, certain areas are in fact being encouraged to grow, and students will go into these fields. But it's not clear that when they actually get their degrees, their job prospects are going to be any better than before, okay? Because the markets change so much. And so this, I think, causes an enormous amount of discontent at lots of levels. Because first of all, especially for the students, because the students are actually promised in a way that if they get a university degree, they'll be in a better position to get a job. And so what that means, especially in the Western countries, is that very often students will be spending a lot of money, usually their parents' money, but money, to in fact get these degrees, which then do not get them jobs. And then they find themselves having been, out of the job market for 3 or 4 years while they were trying to get these degrees. And so this is a real problem, right? This is a real problem, and it causes an enormous amount of discontent in the West. And as far as I understand, China has its own version of this, where there are a lot of underemployed, academically trained people, and that the government is actually having a hard time actually directing universities to actually produce the kinds of graduates that are actually needed, because my own view is I don't think it's possible. I don't think universities can function in that way. And this is why I would say, and I'll end the response here, why it's important that universities actually focus on what they're good at. Not just trying to, reach financial targets or government targets, but rather to teach stuff like the liberal arts, like the fundamental kind of academic subjects, which academics know how to teach well, and which in fact can equip people, regardless of what job they have, with a kind of broader base knowledge for life. Because that is what a university potentially can give you, is a kind of knowledge for life, which goes beyond whatever particular job you happen to get.
What was a time when you were a student, like the academia or the university was like?
Right. So we're talking about 40 to 50 years ago now. The knowledge economy wasn't yet there, okay? So I actually began my academic career just before what I've just been talking about happened. So it was a different world. First of all, it was a lot less expensive to go to university.
Yeah.
So I have never been in debt. I had scholarship the whole time, and so
Even undergraduates?
yeah, everything.
Wow.
Yeah, everything. So I never had to pay. Though I went to private universities, I never had to pay. And it was a different ball game. I mean, basically, when you trained as an academic, you were training to do research and teaching, and you got your PhD, and then you might have one postdoc before you get a regular academic appointment, which is what in Britain we call probationary. In America, it's called tenurable, right? So you have this kind of limited period where you have to prove yourself, and then after you prove yourself, you basically have a regular post forever, right? That was how it was back in those days, and that was kind of the system that actually I advanced through. So I became a full professor, chair, at the age of 35. But those were the old days. Nowadays, it's quite different. Nowadays, first of all, in terms of the skills that you need to have in order to be an academic, it is not sufficient just to do research and teaching well. You also have to be able to raise grant money.
Okay.
And sometimes quite substantial grant money, because more and more universities are making it more and more difficult to simply be able to do research through the university funding, right? So in other words, you need external funding increasingly to do any substantial kind of research activity. That is something of our time. And in fact, people nowadays can get professorships primarily on the basis of being good grant raisers. Right. So in other words, if you can, as we call it in the trade, rainmaker,
Okay.
someone who can raise the money.
Okay,
All the time, right? And so you don't need to be that distinguished yourself as an academic in terms of publications, but if you could bring in a lot of money, then you're set. Someone's going to make you professor. Because universities are actually in relatively desperate economic situation, much worse situation than they were 40, 50 years ago. And so, all the money you can bring in, especially if this money can be used to support graduate students and postdocs, you are running, you're in effect running your own little mini welfare state, right? Because you basically are the one responsible for funding all these people.
Yeah.
So when your grant money runs out, all these people working under you are just starving. They have no money, and so they become very dependent on you in that respect.
But how can a young scholar become that kind of person after a graduation right away? It's impossible, right?
This is where it becomes, part of what you do when you become a postdoc, because look, not everybody goes to the best universities in the world, okay? And so let's say you're a very ambitious person. You get your PhD from a relatively middling university, but you want to, in a way, do very well in academia, and especially with regard to grant money and stuff. What you want to then do is to get a postdoc at a prestigious place.
Okay.
Right? And what will happen when you're the postdoc is that you will be part of this larger research team, and you'll get to experience what this big professor is like when he's raising all this money and running these big labs and things like this.
And publication as well.
Yeah. And you will get some publications out of it, usually co-authored with other people, including with this great professor who probably doesn't contribute very much except providing your salary. And then you learn stuff, right? You learn stuff that way.
Okay.
You kind of learn what kind of person it takes. And so what happens is that you don't need to publish as much while people are publishing all the time, there's no doubt about it. Nevertheless, the publications in a way don't quite carry as much weight as they used to, because the money can make up for it. Right? The money can make up for it in a way it couldn't have done in the past, okay? The average academic now, and I'm talking about a successful academic, is one who probably will have gone through 1 or 2 postdocs, maybe even 3, right? God. Typically at real, as good places as they can find as possible. Right? So they want that on their CVs. They want that they were at Harvard, they were at Oxford, even if it was just for a year or 2, right? Right? You put that on there, and then you might get a regular post, and that regular post will allow you then to get your own grant money, right? And that's how you grow your career, as it were. And so you might become a professor, by the time you're 40 or something, though most people these days, it takes closer to 50 to do it, because there are so many steps you have to go along the way now. But it's a very tricky business, because even if you are someone who gets a lot of money, the money isn't always guaranteed, okay? And it then becomes very important that you are part of the right networks of people who also get money. So you have like a little system going, right? And that's really the only way in which you can really survive and thrive in today's academia, is to be within that kind of big system, where you're sort of a player in there. I'm saying this from the standpoint of people who wish to be very ambitious. It's very difficult to be a very ambitious scholar these days and be alone, right? And do it alone. In my day, you could do it alone still. But I think it is much, much harder now for academics to thrive, because it's become such big business. And the university administration expects the academics to behave a bit like business people.
If a STEM pupil comes, after graduation of his PhD and goes right away into the industry and gain loads of, experience, and he can prove that he can bring loads of money, after that, can academia still accept him?
Oh, yeah.
That's one of his strengths.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a bit, that is quite different from the way it used to be. I think in the past, somebody who spent most of their career in business and then wanted to go back into academia would have been seen as a bit suspicious, especially if they hadn't been doing much publishing or something in the meanwhile. But I think now that's a totally different story. I think if you're someone who has the proper academic degree in one of the STEM subjects, and you go into industry for several years and you actually manage to do very well in that context, right, especially with raising money, then you're an ideal person to be hired by even very major university, and you might be hired as a dean. So there is a possibility for a person like that to actually enter pretty high up in the administrative food chain. So even a pro vice chancellor, right, for university industry relations or something like that, right? There such people all over the place now, and in fact, it's not hard. It's not common, rather. It's not uncommon for people in senior administration, even in universities like Warwick, to have some kind of industry past.
So it's all about money.
To a certain extent, that's true. To a certain extent, that's true, and it reflects. It reflects this policy that is to a large extent related to this knowledge economy stuff I talked about earlier, where the universities have agreed and have come to be seen, engines of society, engines of the economy, right? So they become very integral to the way in which the society works. And so that generally means they have to expand, right? Which means they have to increase their capital. Now, this is a choice universities have largely made for themselves. But what it does do is it can arguably hollow out the core mission of the university. University loses its soul effectively because it becomes so much a money-making enterprise, right? So it has been common, especially in the United States, for example. People who run the universities, the people who are called presidents in America, we call them whatever, rectors, vice chancellors, people like that, right? That those people are very often people who have experience managing companies that have, let's say, roughly the same employees and capital flow as the university does, but it's not a university. It's a business, right? You see, but they're structurally similar. And so this guy then looks like he's very qualified to run a university. This is very common now. It's a nightmare. There have been issues about this in this country. These issues come up from time to time, especially when it's been floated that let's say a vice chancellor of a prestigious university, let's say like Imperial College London or something like that, decides to appoint someone who has a very strong background in industry to be the vice chancellor, right? That raised a lot of eyebrows. That happened maybe 20, 25 years ago. Those kinds of issues are very tricky. There was this vice chancellor of Oxford, maybe 25 years ago, named Hood, H-O-O-D, from New Zealand, who was an Oxford graduate but had spent quite a lot of years in business. Part of the reason why he was appointed was to shake up the Oxford colleges. Because if you know anything about Oxford or Cambridge, you know that most of the power in these universities are in the college. Yes. Exactly. They're not in the central administration. Mm-hmm. It's very different from modern universities.
In the college as well.
Exactly. Yeah. That you got it. Yeah. So what they did was they brought this guy Hood in, and his job was going to be to consolidate all the money. Right? So it's not all just stuck in the colleges and you constantly need to get the college's permission, and every college is different, right?
Yeah,
every college
different policy, different focus.
Yeah, so it becomes very difficult actually for Oxford as a university to act in a very decisive way. Mm-hmm. And if you notice anything about Oxford in the recent past, right, most of the innovative stuff that it's been doing has come from external money, right? Donors, right? Donors providing few $100 million here, $1 billion there. But the thing is, it's totally from the outside. Right? Because if you look at the money that Oxford itself has, it's tied up in the colleges. So they brought this guy Hood in, and they basically got rid of him after a few years. The colleges got rid of him. Yeah, because he was imposing more proper business. And he was trying to consolidate the money, and he wanted to, destroy the power of the colleges as financial centers, and it didn't work. It didn't work. He got voted out, basically. So that's a real, so Oxford and Cambridge, are still holding out, right? But the rest of the universities, I think, are very much
like a company.
Yeah, exactly. They're certainly open for that kind of treatment because of the size and the scope of what the universities are doing these days. Of course, there are the problems if you can't bring in enough money. There's always that problem, right? But then there's also the problem that comes for if you do bring in the money, because that shows you something about how you've changed the university culture, right? Because as soon as you start bringing in all these big bucks, those big bucks change everything. So, for example, in a university like this one, right, the vast majority of the money comes from the business school. Okay?
Or maybe WMG as well.
Yeah, well, exactly, which is not much different. And this has an enormous amount of impact on the way the campus operates, the way it looks, right? The significance of buildings and so forth. And this happens everywhere now, right? That basically the parts of the campus that bring in the most money, in a way, get to shape and control how the entire university is. And let me just read one more thing. One thing that in the past used to mitigate against this tendency was this financial strategy the universities had, and this university was very famous for having it, actually. And it's called cross-subsidization. And cross-subsidization means that regardless of where the money comes from, so let's say 80% of the money comes from WMG or the business school or whatever in this university, that money just doesn't stay in those places. Yeah. That money gets used to subsidize other things. Cross-subsidization, exactly. Because because the university has an interest in keeping everyone with enough money so they can actually do their research, even if they don't have the same capacity to raise their own money, right? Because humanists cannot raise as much money as business school people can, right? I mean, it's pretty obvious. But does that mean the humanities starve? No, because you have this principle of cross-subsidization. Well, this is tricky. This is tricky, right? Especially as we see the disparities between the amount of money that, let's say, a business school or a medical school or something like that can pull in versus what the humanities, which are getting less and less money as time goes on, the disparities between the very wealthy parts of the university and the more impoverished parts of the university are getting so wide, the guys, who get all the money say, why can't we just keep it? If these guys, why can't these humanists raise their own money? What's the matter with these guys? They lazy? What's their problem? Or maybe they have nothing to sell. Maybe these humanists are totally useless. Maybe you should get rid of them, right? I mean, the point is we do have conversations about this kind of thing. So universities, if they really want to remain universities, have to really emphasize this principle of cross-subsidization.
But there's no perfect way,
No. I mean, all of it is pretty desperate, but there are better and worse ways. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
You are from America, but what attracted you to come here?
Oh, the job market. I was invited to apply for a chair at University of Durham, and I got it. And that meant a major career boost. I was just recently tenured in the United States as associate professor, and I was invited to apply for the established chair in sociology at the University of Durham, and I got it. And I was 35 at the time, and that was part of a strategy, by the way. Again, you're probably too young to remember, but in the 1980s, there was a brain drain from Britain to the United States because under Margaret Thatcher, universities, especially humanistic subjects and social sciences and things, actually were, and even the natural sciences, were subject to severe budget cuts. And Thatcher basically wanted to put the money for universities in the more practical areas, you might say, business schools, medical schools, engineering, this kind of thing. And so a lot of the people, from the more traditional academic subjects were lured to the United States. And so that was the brain drain. Well, then after John Major, who was her successor, became prime minister, and the British economy started to improve. That's the other thing too. The British economy became better, and so with that improvement, he decided to implement a reverse brain drain strategy, where what he was going to do was to bring in young American academics who were very promising, and then promote them very quickly to a chair, right? And a lot of people came in around that time, actually. And so we're talking about 1990, early 1990s, right? And I stayed, but that was kind of how I got there. I mean, I did my MPhil at Cambridge, and the journal I founded, Social Epistemology, is published by Taylor and Francis in this country. And so I have had a long relationship with the UK, even before I got the chair. So I was pretty well known in that sense, and so it wasn't that hard a transition to make. I know, other Americans find Britain a quite different place, but I do think a lot depends on your lifestyle and maybe even what part of the country you come from. I come from the Northeast, New York, and that part of America is the part that you might say is closest to Europe in various ways, and so that probably made a difference as well. But that was really the reason. It was I was invited to apply, and I took the invitation and got the chair. So at one level, I'm quite a well-known academic, but being well-known is a double-edged sword, because, in a way they know too much about you, right? They know too much about what you think. They know too much about what you're like. And so, I would have thought that only a very particular kind of job possibility would work for me, and probably that possibility would be coming from someone who already knows who I am. Right. So in other words, I'm not the kind of person who at this stage in my career would just be applying blind for something. Right.
Makes sense.
Yeah. But I am open. It's not out of the question. No, I mean, and this, I'll tell you right, one thing I think that might be obvious from what I've said so far is I'm not sure I would survive in today's academia if I were starting out. In fact, I have a lot of students over the years who've been, done PhDs with me and so forth, and actually relatively few of them have, in fact, they haven't, as it were, followed in my footsteps in the sense. So my whole academic career has primarily been research and teaching. I haven't done serious administration or anything like that. I haven't raised large amounts of money. I haven't done any of that. Okay, but that's actually the kind of thing you need to do to survive in academia today. And that's why I would say I don't know if I would be cut out for today's academia if I were starting now. I might think about a different career. It makes a difference when, because occasionally you get these students who come to you and they say, "Oh, Professor Fuller, what you do is so interesting. Yeah. I want to do what you do." Yeah. I say, "Good luck." Oh. And it's not because you don't have the talent. It's just because the world has changed.
Yes.
The world has changed. This is,
Exactly. That's the key point.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the roles have changed.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you have stated that I predict the number of universities will decrease
Yes.
in the future, right?
Yes.
And the number of students will also decline. However, back in my country, new university continue to be established every year.
Yeah.
So why do you think China remains so eager to establish new universities even now?
My view is part of it, I think, is that China is coming into this knowledge economy thing a little bit later than the West is. And so in a sense, it's kind of following the same pattern, but from starting from behind. So in other words, I would guess that in a few years' time, even the Chinese will recognize they have too many universities. I think that day is going to come. I think, however, that one of the functions of universities in China, which is distinct to China, it does become a kind of a certain way of enforcing social control in intellectual people. If you want to talk about organs where people are provided with, state propaganda, whatever you want to call it. Universities are the place. And so they certainly function in that capacity, independently of whatever economic value they have. I think they have a kind of political value. And I think that makes it quite different from the West, because in the West, universities don't really have that much political value. And so if they don't succeed economically, they could well collapse out of their own accord, right? Whereas I think in China, there is a kind of incentive perhaps to have universities there as kind of ideological warlords, of the country. And so they might hold on to them longer. But I don't see economically that it makes much sense.
UK's university nowadays rely a lot on Chinese students, whether it's on their tuition fee or the number of those Chinese students. But I think the geopolitical factors may alter this trend. So over the years, what changes have you observed, in general in international higher education system?
Okay, I think, if we're looking at the UK, there has definitely been a decline in European students.
After
Brexit. After Brexit, yes. Yeah. So that's kind of noticeable. The Chinese students still keep on coming. We have had waves of Indian students, a lot having to do, though, with the state of the Indian economy. So that fluctuates a bit. I would say, I actually think we're going to continue to get Chinese students, and I think this university certainly, and I think this is true of all UK universities, are acting in a way that's kind of China-friendly, even though they realize that there are all kinds of political issues involved. But certainly in the case of this university, there's a lot of interest in cultivating connections with China, especially ones that involve money. Because I do think if you want to talk about an international source of money for universities in the future, China is actually the leading one. I can't really think of any other single place that is going to be inclined to invest as much in terms of sending over students and also in terms of research money than China. And I think all universities in this country realize that. And so I think it would have to take, a government prohibition of dealing with China, right? If somehow, because we have these scandals coming up every now and then about Chinese spies all over the place. So far, they haven't amounted to that much, right? But, if there were a time when, China was seen as kind of the sort of threat that Russia is seen as, for example, right? Russia is sort of seen as very problematic. That would cut off a major source of income to the universities in this country. So, I think it would take a very extreme political situation to stop the UK from interacting very strongly with China.
But the fact is, Chinese scholars are like starving. Where is the funding? Where is the money?
No, I know. No, I think a lot of this Chinese funding of international stuff is part of the confidence game with the West, right? Influencing the West in various ways.
Tomorrow you are going to have your new book launch, right? Media and the Power of Knowledge. And I've read some of this bit. And you state transition from academic to public intellectual is fully accomplished only when exchanges the verbal signs of expert authority, jargon for the target audience, universe of discourse. What is your way of being a public intellectual?
Well, so first of all, I address many different audiences in different settings. I actually think teaching is a very good preparation for this, because when you're teaching, right, obviously you're relaying to students things that you already know, but typically the way you would have learned what you know is in this, expert authority jargon kind of way. And so then the trick is to how to get that knowledge across to people who will not have read what you have read, right? And so what that means is you have to translate your expert knowledge into something they can understand. And that's kind of the first step to being a public intellectual, is to be able to exercise this kind of translation function. And so I do that. I do all these podcasts like this one, where one is, as it were, forced to talk to the level at which the question is being asked. One is not just giving a speech or whatever, right? I mean, there's this kind of interaction where you always, as it were, there has to be a common level, right, of understanding. And I think this has implications, I think, also for graduate education, because graduate students who are trained to be academics are only trained how to do research. They're never trained how to teach.
Yeah.
And teaching, like I just said, is the way in which you actually exercise the public function of the intellectual as an academic, is through teaching. And since graduate students aren't taught how to teach, they really, when they get into a classroom, right, they often, I mean, some graduate students actually have a sense of this. They actually know how to talk to real people. But a lot of them, in a way, are so much caught up in their own research and somehow thinking that what they have to do in the classroom is to represent that research, right, that they are incomprehensible and the students find them off-putting, and all of that stuff happens all the time. So I do think we need a reform of graduate education to enable graduate students to be better teachers. So it's really that simple. But then there's one other thing I would say, and this goes to the younger scholars, which is, I think if you want to be a public intellectual these days, you have to be multimedia competent. And by that I mean, it's not just enough to be able to write and talk, which is kind of what I do. But I do think the idea of being able to produce videos, being able to engage in all kinds of events, yes, but also to engage in social media interventions, right? Because you have to think about where are the people getting their knowledge and information from, and in a sense, you have to be engaging those platforms. It doesn't, I mean, there are reasons, like we're talking now in the context of this book of mine tomorrow, and there is a context in which a book like mine still makes sense in this world, right? But nevertheless, most people I know will not read it. And one reason why we're having the podcast tomorrow to launch the book is to provide an alternative medium through which people can, find out stuff that's going on in the book, right? And that might lead them to read the book. But even if it doesn't lead them to read the book, they will probably come away knowing something they didn't know before, which comes from the book, right? And so in a sense, you have to be able to play with this kind of multimedia environment if you really are going to do the full public intellectual thing these days.
So if you give you a chance to, design one of your own university, the rules, the policy, everything, disciplines, curriculum, how would you design an ideal university in your mind, in your way?
Okay, so the first thing would be, this would probably be a small university. It would be a university where the focus is on teaching and research, and especially, I would say, on the teaching side, and especially on the performative element of teaching, right? So in other words, when people go to a university, a student should be able to have a sense in the classroom that they're dealing with someone who is, as it were, a man or a person of knowledge, right? In other words, what is it like to be able to get in front of a room and to be able to talk about very complex topics where all kinds of views have been represented, and talk about it coherently for a sustained period of time, and be able to do it in the way in which the audience understands it. Right? Now, that is not a trivial skill. That is not a skill you can just learn by reading books or watching videos. It's a skill you actually have to see performed, right? It's like acting, right? You actually have to see it to understand it. And I think, unlike the way universities operate in terms of how they employ people these days, I would actually require that there be a kind of teaching audition for anyone who's hired at this university. So the teaching component would be strong, but there would be research required as well. The other thing I would say is that you would choose people who are intellectually interesting regardless of discipline, but you want to, as it were, the kind of spread of disciplines that we normally understand, you would want that intellectual spread represented somehow, even if everybody's kind of interdisciplinary, right? So you want the spread represented, but it doesn't have to be divided up by disciplines. The other thing I would say is that the university's research agenda and general orientation should be run, as it were, as collegially as possible, in the sense that the people who are the academics are the ones who run the university, and that the administrators are just administrators. In other words, they are not pretend captains of industry. They're not make-believe, great geniuses of higher education, right? They don't set grand challenges and other BS concepts, right? What they do is they facilitate the academics, who really are the intellectual backbone of the university, facilitate their activities, right? So in other words, the senior administration of the university would be like a somewhat more paid version of the administrators who work at the department level, right? They would not be leaders, right? They would not have grand challenges. And the main reason for that is they don't do them very well. They waste a lot of energy and effort, and sometimes even money. And also, these university grand challenges, every university has the same one, right? So they're not distinctive in any way, right? Usually it's about sustainable this, that, and the other thing. And so I would say you would want then a very diminished senior administration that just basically is facilitating the bread and butter issues, which is research and teaching.
Utopian University come true one day by Steve Fuller.
Yeah.
Thanks, Steve, for your time and contribution, and see you next time.
Okay, righto. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.